On a rainy night, Anna was driving alone on a deserted road. The sound of rain against the windshield was almost hypnotic, but she was determined to reach her destination. Suddenly, she saw a figure by the roadside, frantically waving. It was a man, drenched, with tattered clothes and a desperate look in his eyes. Against her better judgment, Anna stopped and offered him a ride. He entered the car silently, muttering a barely audible, "Thank you." As they drove, Anna tried to make conversation, but he remained silent, staring straight ahead. The only thing he said was that he needed to get to a small village a few miles away. The journey continued in uncomfortable silence until Anna realized she hadn't seen any signs indicating the village he mentioned. When she looked at him, he had disappeared. Terrified, she pulled over and looked around, but there was no trace of the man. Feeling a chill down her spine, Anna decided to drive on, believing he had gotten out while she was distracted. Finally, she arrived at the village, but something felt wrong. The houses were in ruins, and the place was deserted. She stopped at an abandoned gas station and found an old newspaper. The headline read, "Tragic accident kills man on the road." The picture was of the man she had picked up. The accident had occurred exactly 1 year before, on that same night. Raphael was driving back from a party, taking the dark, winding road through the forest. The clock on the car's dashboard showed midnight when he saw a young woman waving by the roadside. She was dressed in white, looking even paler in the headlights' glow. Without hesitation, he stopped and offered her a ride. She got in and thanked him with a soft voice, but something about her eyes unsettled him. They seemed empty. She said she lived in a house by the lake, a few miles ahead. During the drive, Raphael noticed the temperature inside the car had dropped drastically. Trying to ignore the discomfort, he kept driving. When they reached the house, she got out and asked him to wait a moment. Raphael waited, but she didn't return. Worried, he got out and approached the door. An elderly woman opened it, and he asked about the young woman. The woman began to cry, saying her daughter had died years ago, drowned in the lake. Raphael insisted he had given her a ride, describing the young woman in detail. The elderly woman led him to a room in the house where there was a photo of the young woman. It was the same girl he had picked up. Raphael ran back to his car, his heart pounding. When he returned to the car, he found the passenger seat soaked, as if someone had emerged from the depths of the lake to hitch a ride. Carlos and Julia were on a road trip, exploring quiet rural roads in search of adventure. The day was perfect until the car started having issues. With no other option, they stopped and tried to fix the engine, but it seemed to be a more serious problem. While they debated what to do, a man appeared out of nowhere, offering help. He seemed friendly and knowledgeable about cars, so they accepted his help. He worked on the engine for a while and managed to get the car running again. Grateful, Carlos and Julia offered him a ride to the nearest town. He accepted and sat in the back seat, remaining silent during the drive. As they drove, the road became narrower and darker. The man, who initially seemed normal, started behaving strangely. He whispered incoherent words, and his eyes gleamed in a disturbing way. Julia, sitting in the passenger seat, began to feel a growing fear. Suddenly, the man ordered Carlos to stop the car at a specific point on the road. Reluctantly, Carlos obeyed. The man got out of the car and pointed to a narrow path leading into the forest, saying there was something he needed to show them. Carlos and Julia hesitated, but the man insisted, and curiosity won over fear. They followed the man down a winding path until they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old wooden cabin. The man opened the door and invited them inside. As they entered, the air grew heavy, and a foul stench filled the place. The walls were covered with strange symbols, and human bones were scattered across the floor. Carlos and Julia tried to flee, but the door slammed shut with a bang, and the man revealed his true form, a monstrous, grotesque creature with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. Trapped and terrified, they heard the man's sinister laughter echo through the cabin as he slowly approached, ready to devour their souls. John was returning from a late business meeting. The road was deserted, except for the distant sound of crickets and the wind whistling through the trees. Suddenly, he saw a woman in white by the roadside, frantically waving for help. Reluctant but feeling morally obligated, he stopped the car. She quickly got in, thanking him with a soft, trembling voice. The woman said her name was Clara and that she needed to get home, a few miles ahead. As they talked, John noticed that the temperature inside the car seemed to drop drastically, and he began to feel an inexplicable chill. When they reached her destination, an old farmhouse, Clara got out and thanked him again. John saw an old man come out of the house and approach. He looked heartbroken, but when he saw Clara, he fell to his knees, crying. John was confused until the man explained that his daughter, Clara, had died 10 years ago in a car accident on that very stretch of road. Unable to understand what was happening, John returned to his car. On the back seat where Clara had sat was a white handkerchief stained with blood. Terrified, he sped off, vowing never to pick up strangers again. Laura and Peter were returning from a party in a nearby town. The road that passed by the old cemetery was the quickest route home. As they passed the rusty gates, they saw a man looking desolate, waving for a ride. They hesitated, but thinking he might be in trouble, they stopped. The man got in the car and asked to be taken to a nearby house. During the drive, he told them eerie stories about the cemetery and local legends, making Laura and Peter increasingly uneasy. When they arrived at the destination, a ruined house, he got out and vanished into the darkness. Curious and a bit frightened, they decided to investigate. The house was in ruins, full of cobwebs and broken furniture. In the corner of the main room, they found an old diary. The last entries spoke of a man who had recently died and whose spirit still roamed the area, seeking revenge for his unjust death. As they left the house, they saw the man again, now with a grim and menacing expression. Realizing they had given a ride to a vengeful spirit, they ran back to their car and drove away, vowing never to go near that cemetery again. Marcos was returning home after a long day at work. The night was cold, and a thick fog covered the road. He saw a young woman with long, disheveled hair hitchhiking. Against his instinct, he stopped and offered her a ride. She quickly got in without saying a word. As they drove, Marcos noticed the woman was trembling. He tried asking if she was okay, but she only muttered incoherent words. When he looked at her again, he saw her eyes filled with tears, and she looked desperate. Finally, she pointed to an old abandoned house and asked to be dropped off there. Marcos hesitated but stopped the car. Before leaving, she handed him a crumpled piece of paper. When he looked, he saw it was a farewell letter, where she explained that she had taken her own life in that house years ago, and that her spirit was trapped, seeking help to find peace. Frightened, Marcos looked at the house and saw the silhouette of the woman in the window, sadly waving. He sped off, heart racing, vowing never to pick up strangers again. Edward was driving on a stormy night, the wind and rain making visibility almost nil. He saw a man by the roadside, desperately waving. Edward stopped, and the man got in, thanking him with a nervous smile. As they drove, the man began to tell a disturbing story about how he had been pursued by a malevolent entity. Edward thought it was just the man's imagination, until he started seeing strange shadows at the road's edges, keeping pace with the car. The man began to scream, pointing at something outside the car. Edward looked and saw a tall, skeletal figure running alongside the vehicle. Terrified, he accelerated, but the figure continued to follow them. The hitchhiker began to cry, saying the entity wouldn't leave them alone. Finally, the man begged Edward to stop the car. When he did, the man ran into the forest, disappearing into the storm. Edward, terrified, continued driving until he found a town. When he told the locals his story, they explained that the man was a fugitive who had made a pact with a malevolent entity to escape his pursuers, but was now eternally hunted. Sophia was returning from a visit to a friend's house in a distant town. The road was long and dark, with no streetlights for miles. Suddenly she saw a man hitchhiking. He seemed normal, but there was something about his eyes that unsettled her. Against her instinct, she stopped, and he got into the car. During the drive, he started talking about the darkness of the road and how easy it was to get lost there. As he spoke, Sophia began to feel an intense cold and a growing sense of panic. The man seemed to know too much about her, mentioning details of her life he shouldn't have known. Sophia tried to hide her fear, but when she looked at him again, she saw that he was smiling in a disturbing way. He pointed to a curve up ahead and told her she should turn there. Without knowing why, she obeyed, but the road seemed to grow darker and more sinister. Finally, the man asked to be let out. When he left the car, Sophia felt immediate relief. But when she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw that he had disappeared. Terrified, she returned to the main road and drove straight home, vowing never to pick up strangers again. Michael and Anna were on a vacation, exploring rural areas and swamps. Night fell, and they got lost on a back road. Seeing a man by the roadside hitchhiking, they stopped and offered help. The man got in, thanking them and saying he needed to get to a house near the swamp. As they drove, the man told macabre stories about the swamp of spirits haunting the area and people who disappeared without a trace. Anna began to feel a chill, and Michael tried to hide his discomfort. When they reached the swamp, the man asked to be let out. He pointed to a trail leading into the heart of the swamp and said his house was there. Michael and Anna said their goodbyes, but when they looked back, he had vanished. Curious, they decided to follow the trail. The dense vegetation and strange sounds of the swamp created an atmosphere of terror. Finally, they found an old abandoned cabin. Inside, there were photos of missing people and personal belongings, including a diary that told the story of a man who had been murdered there and whose spirit now roamed the swamp, luring innocent victims. Terrified, Michael and Anna ran back to the car and sped away, vowing never to venture down unknown roads again. Philip was driving home after visiting friends in a distant town. The road was long and deserted, with no other cars in sight. He saw a man by the roadside, looking lost and desperate. Philip stopped and offered him a ride. The man got in and explained that he was trying to get home, but had been stuck on the road for what felt like an eternity. As they drove, Philip noticed that the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of dawn. The man began to talk about a curse that had trapped him in an eternal night, unable to reach his destination. Philip listened, feeling increasingly uneasy as the road ahead seemed to loop back on itself. Finally, the man asked Philip to stop the car, pointing to a trail leading into a dark forest. Reluctantly, Philip agreed and followed the man into the woods. Deep in the forest, they found an ancient altar where a dark entity awaited. Philip confronted the entity and struck a deal to free the man. The entity agreed, but demanded Philip take on the curse. When Philip returned to the car, the man had disappeared, but now Philip was trapped in an endless night, driving on a road that never ended.